All right. Well, welcome, Paul. I want to thank you for spending some time today to engage in this conversation. And so we'll start off with just some introductions. So I'll start off and then I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm Robin Withers, and I am a member of St. Luke's Episcopal. And I've been a member, I guess it's been, I kind of count in holidays. So I think this last Christmas was my third pageant. Okay. So I go by.
Okay.
So it was my third. So I think it's been about 3 years that I've been a member, and I've attended probably maybe 3.5 years that I've been part of St. Luke's, and I've been enjoyed it. I participate in the children's ministry and at times in the youth ministry, and I am honored and privileged to serve as a lector, often being able to read the scriptures on Sunday morning and just participate in the community. So it's been a lifeline for me, and I've enjoyed it, and really appreciate the mission of our church. So Paul, how about you?
My name is Paul. I'm a teacher at Helix High School in La Mesa, and I have been going to St. Luke's for about a little more than a year. I guess about almost 1.5 years now. We started attending regularly. This has been our second Christmas there, so that's the marker that we'll use. We are, we've been really blessed to be a part of the St. Luke's community. We're so grateful for that space, and for it's been an amazing congregation for us.
It is. And thank you. And I remember when you came, and of course your two little kids, Gideon and Lucy, are a joy to have in Sunday school, and just in the church community itself. And I'm glad you, as we talk about introductions, I also want to acknowledge the fact that Father Colin and Mother Laurel have made space for these conversations or these videos to happen, and I really appreciate that. I know we as a congregation appreciate that, and I know it's a lot of work, but it's the right work, and so to make space to have conversations is really critical, especially around the topics that we're going to be discussing today and have been on videos for the last couple of times. So I want to welcome everyone that's watching to a time of what I call courageous conversations. And we're going to call it Courageous Conversations because they are courageous. These conversations today that Paul and I are going to engage in are going to be focused around the topic of race, racism, and the role of white folk, black folk, and the role of the church in this current time that we're in. And they're also courageous because it's difficult oftentimes to stay engaged, and it's maybe difficult to experience discomfort, and it also may be difficult to speak our truth. And I know it's definitely difficult for me to expect and accept non-closure. But those are the four agreements, or really the four agreements that hold courageous conversation in a frame. Yeah. So I want to thank you again, Paul. So let's go ahead and kind of just jump right in, since we're going to agree to stay engaged and experience discomfort. So let's go ahead and just jump in here. I wanted to start off, Paul, with the first question for you. I know that we're going to move from the broad topic of racism, race, and the role of white folk, black folk, and I want to really focus a little bit more to examine specifically what's happening across our nation and indeed the world, but more specifically what's happening right now in our city and our state or our local communities. And I understand that you've had the opportunity to be actively engaged in some of the protests that have been led in the city. So what I like to do is I like to focus in on that a little bit more, because I know that through the protests against racism and specifically policing systems and policies of policing and police brutality that have led to the death of women, of black men, black women, black folk, whether it's LGBTQIA, because we certainly know that our trans folk are also experiencing a high rate of brutalization. So when we just look at the whole spectrum, if we were to drop a microphone into your brain, and I really hope this never happens for me, but if we were able to drop a microphone into your brain, what would be the internal dialogue that we would hear you having with yourself regarding your decision to participate in the recent protests and marches?
Thanks. That is a good question. As we, so I like everyone watched the video of the murder of George Floyd, and then was outraged and sad and discouraged, and I think angry is like the emotion that came to mind first for me, and the thought that this is happening again, like it's happened so many times, and in the the recent past, and then obviously the not so recent past also. So the first chance that I saw to get involved, I was encouraged to see that there was going to be a march in La Mesa. La Mesa is a community that is near and dear to me. I went to Helix High School, I teach there. And so I was sure as soon as I saw that that was going to be a thing, that I was going to attend that march, and especially attend that march in support of my students, in particular students of color, who I was hoping would be at the march too, and just to be there to let them know that adults in their lives value them, that are not afraid to say Black Lives Matter, that are there to affirm that in as loud and public a way as possible. So that decision, the decision to get involved there, was pretty easy for me and immediate. It felt like that it's important for me, it seems like it's important for people who look like me, as sort of like a middle-aged white man, to say, hey, I see this happening, and I know that this is wrong, right? And to both recognize the ways that I've benefited from systemic racism and white privilege and injustice, but also to affirm that Black Lives Matter, and that I don't want that to be the situation anymore. So that first protest was easy to participate in. I was part of the group that went onto the 8 freeway and helped to close the 8 freeway, and we kept that the freeway closed for 4 hours or whatever it was for most of the day, and then marched back to the police station. And then I was with my sister, who's been involved in activism in San Diego for quite some time, and then we left about 4:30 and got home. And when I arrived back at home, we learned that the protests in La Mesa had sort of taken a turn, that the police had fired tear gas at protesters. And then that evening, large chunks of sort of the shopping mall area, where I'm really familiar with, I've spent lots of time, was, parts of that were burned. And so that was a hard night to try and process all of those things happening at the same time. But then the next day there was a protest downtown, and I think the internal dialogue around deciding to continue to protest and to participate, even though there had been violence the night before, was sort of an important step for me to say, like, I recognize that was, like, there are lots of problems with looting and violence, and I certainly don't want that to happen, but I also don't want that to become the narrative that is dominant, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm still going out to affirm that. And so I spoke with a friend who's also a white man who's an adoptive father of Black sons, and we decided to go down about 7 or so, knowing that curfew was at 8 that night on Sunday night, and take part in it was a prayerful vigil that was happening at the just the county building downtown on the waterfront. And then while we were there, we saw police shoot tear gas at a group of peaceful protesters who were just there for a vigil. They were there for a candlelight vigil, and we watched police scatter that group of people with tear gas and rubber bullets. And it was a really formative experience, and sort of a shocking experience to see police in the way that, as a white man, I had never seen police as this threat who might do something that was scary and unprovoked. Hadn't felt like something that was real to me, and it was made much more real to me that night.
That's thank you for sharing. That's I appreciate you your honesty or your vulnerability in saying how you experience police, because that's something I've never been able to say, that when I see police, I never experienced them from a protect and serve. I'm always anxious and apprehensive when I encounter police, and actually always anticipate the worst, because that's just been my reality from as long as I can remember, and actually have been schooled that way.
Yeah.
I mean, to protect myself, I've been really schooled and socialized that way. So I think you answered some of it, but I'm going to pose a question again. The second question I had for you was, is it hopeful to get involved? And what is the role of white people in these protests? I read an article this morning that came, I'm not sure if it was in the New York Times or Huffington Post, I'm not sure where I read it, but it was actually posing the question to the Black community, should we have white allies involved, or is this something we need to do on our own, or is there, because we're hearing about the boogaloos or the infiltrators into the protests who happen to be creating chaos, and so can you speak to that? Is it hopeful to get involved, and maybe focus really in on what do you see the role of white folk in this protest?
I think it has been really hopeful for me, and I'm going to ask you in a moment how you feel about that role, because I think but for me, it's been hopeful that night when I spoke to my friend about going down and knowing that we were going to be violating curfew, and saying, like, is there something productive about us in particular being there, and kind of coming to the conclusion that for me the thing that was most productive about being there is, like I said, as someone who is a middle-aged white man, that my voice has ends up being listened to in different places than the voices of, like, a lot of the people there were young or were not white, or were my sister's voice is listened to different than mine because she's been an activist for a long time, and I think it's easy to dismiss sometimes people who've had grievances for a long time. It feels like, oh yeah, I know, but they're just angry or they're upset. And so I thought it was important to have people who are community members who are widely recognized as stable and quiet, to say, like, no, I'm here and I see this and I know what's happening. So I think that the role of white people in the protests, I think, is to give voice to a wider societal discontent around the issues around systemic racism, and in particular around police brutality and the systemic abuse of Black people by police. And it's important, for me at least, it seems like it's important that not just Black people are protesting that white people are also saying, this is a dehumanization of people that we recognize and are not okay with as the majority culture in America either. Okay. Can I ask you about what your perception has been of the role of white people in protests so far?
Well, I would love to say that I'm a middle-aged person, but I'm realizing I'm not really middle-aged anymore. I'm more on the other side of middle. Having turned 61 this past March, I think I definitely think that this is something that we have to do together. And I am always hopeful and encouraged when I see white people in this. And what's really encouraging to me and hopeful to me is how many young white people are in this movement, in this moment. Because I really believe it's through the young people, through children, through youth, that change will occur. Because there are some people that are my age or older who just aren't going to change their mindset.
Right.
I mean, that's just how they are. And so I think, not to say that we can't continue to work with them to change, because I always believe that change is possible. Right. But what gives me hope is seeing the young people. What gives me hope is seeing that white people are actually, or white folk are actually experience some of the same trauma that we have lived with. Because for you to share that fear, it's interesting. I was talking with a friend the other night where she was saying that the sheriff, her father passed away, had a heart attack, and they were coming to tell her, but she didn't know that yet. And it was 11 o'clock at night, and the sheriff knocked on her door. And she said, I got dressed, I turned on the light. She says, I've had my car keys in my hand, I put my wallet in, I did all of this because I didn't know what was going to happen when I opened the door. And I said to her, you're very brave, because I wouldn't have opened the door. I said, I would have had them call, because if it's a non-threatening, like to tell me my father passed, they can tell me that on the phone.
Right.
And then say, can you come meet us to identify the body? Because typically they don't knock anyway for certain communities.
Right.
And that's one of the policing practices we're looking at. When you look at the young lady that was recently shot, that was a no-knock. That people can just knock in and say, oh, I saw a shiny object. Or the gentleman in Denver years ago who was reaching for his can of Coke when they busted in and he got shot because it was a shiny object. I felt feared for my life, and all that. So I appreciate that. And I think there's a role for everyone in this. And it may not be going out to protest, but there are other ways that we protest. We protest with our dollars. We protest in what we are doing immediately. And that's why I really hope that this continues to move from a moment to a true movement that moves beyond the streets, into homes, into communities, into relationships, into what you do in your daily life. So that's what I would say. And I would also say, I think the role of white people in this work is to interrupt, disrupt, dismantle, and collectively rebuild. Because as you said, being power, or the majority in this country has power. And so you have the power to make space, to hold space, and to give space.
Right.
And I think that's a powerful role of an ally.
Can I ask you about this set of protests? I had a conversation this afternoon with a friend of mine whose his son is in Gideon's kindergarten class, and they were the two black boys in Gideon's class. He's a black man. And we were talking today, and he said, at first I had written off these Floyd protests Saturday and Sunday and said, I've done all this before. I was on the streets in Los Angeles in '92 following Rodney King. And he just said, I feel like I've done my time. And he said, my wife asked, why aren't you angry? And he said, I can't be angry, and I can't do this anymore. It's not, it is the emotional energy to go out there and protest is not worth it. But I spoke to him today, and he had been out this week a couple of times. And he said he was feeling more hopeful about systemic change than he has felt really in his lifetime. And I'm just curious to see if that's something, are there elements of this that feel different to you than uprisings in the past? I mean, I remember going on marches even in San Diego, after what happened in Ferguson to Michael Brown. And I'm not old enough to have gone in '92 but I've watched the movements happen around Rodney King. Is there anything about this moment that feels unique to you, or that feels different than previous iterations of this?
Well, I remember Rodney King, and I was young when King was assassinated. Of course, I was a little kid, so I wasn't allowed to go out with my cousins to do what they were going to do. My first year of high school was in a forced integration of school, so I was walked through the pickets and the protests and the names and the dog and all of that. So I have visceral memories of that. I would say that I am angry. I'm very angry. I think I stay, and although people would look and say, oh, you seem very calm, but I am very angry. But what I have, growing up, we were taught you don't really show your anger, because when you show your anger, you give people a way to control you. And I had a mentor once that said, anger, you have to decide if you're going to use it as a fuel to propel you forward, or is it going to be something that consumes you? So I am very angry, but I also think that we have to channel the anger into something productive. And it's how do you move through that anger to still do the work?
Mm-hmm.
You know, especially when you're working with colleagues that are predominantly white that can be very dismissive of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to be so angry that I push people away from the table.
Right.
It's as Dr. King always says, you know, our work is to call people in to be a better version of who God calls them to be, of who Christ calls them to be, and who they really desire to be. You know, I think very few people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to go out, I'm going to just be a flaming racist today. I mean, I know there are some people that, you know, that in white supremacy, that's their goal, but I don't think people really say, this is what I desire to do.
Right.
But what I think oftentimes is they don't know what to do or don't understand the historical implications, or they don't understand the implicit bias that unchecked leads to explicit bias.
Right.
So I feel different in this moment because of the youth, because of it's so sweeping even across the world, yes. And because of the media, and because of people being able to film. Before it was if the reporter happened to catch it. Now everybody has a camera.
Yeah.
So I think people are really seeing that the brutality that we talked about since 1619.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the history of police in Black America, was never about serve and protect.
Right.
It was about oppress and subjugate. So I think people see that now because it's happening to them.
Right.
And to me, I think that's what makes a change is D'Angelo calls it interest convergence. Because when it becomes impactful, or when it becomes an interest to the oppressor, they are more willing to act. So when the curfew now is affecting them, and when their free speech now is being affected, and when they're being shot with, non-lethal bullets and tear gassing, and now they're saying, okay, this is happening to us. So the question becomes now, well, who might be next? And I think that's being raised clearly with the policing in Washington that wear no badges or identification. Who are these people?
Yeah.
And who do they belong to? And really, what is their role in this?
Yeah.
So I am hopeful, and it does feel different. But as an older person, I will also say we'll have to wait and see.
Right.
Because we have been here before.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have been here before. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
So I want to focus a little bit closer, and with your permission, I want to be more specific and focus really on your role as a father who happens to have a beautiful Black child named Gideon. And as a parent, and specifically I'm going to say as a father of a son who is Black, what are really your hopes and dreams for him, and even for both of your children? Because I don't want to separate them out, but I know that their lived experience will be different.
Right.
I mean, that's just the reality of it.
Yeah.
So since we're speaking to race and about that right now, maybe focus, lead on into what that is like, what your hopes and dreams are for your young Black boy that's growing up in America.
Yeah, and one of the things my friend and I talked about today when we were talking was not wanting our kids to have to do this, the marches and protests. And he wasn't optimistic on that front. He said that his lived experience didn't let him feel like this is going to be done, that by the time that our kids are old enough to not have. But I like on the hopes and dreams is a good way to think about it. And I think really I want for both of my kids to have opportunity and to feel like to not feel crushed by the world, right? Like to feel like, hey, you have dreams and you can pursue those dreams, and you can, I know King talks about being judged by the content of your character, right? Like I want my kids to be people who are people of character and who are treated as such, who are not discriminated against because of their gender or orientation or because of their skin color. I want them to have, I think opportunity is the thing that, like, when you ask that question that I keep sort of running through my head, is that I want my kids to have a full opportunity, to have the chance to succeed and to follow their dreams and pursue their dreams, regardless of, any of the sort of tertiary elements about them. I want them to have the opportunity to pursue their dreams.
Okay. Oh, thank you. And let's see. Let's talk about your, I'm going to jump down to another question, and we'll come back, and then I'll speak to hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
But while we're speaking with you. So
yeah.
What are your fears and apprehensions then?
I think it is hard, and something I did not know until I had a Black son was how, and this is an indictment of me, right? But how draining that it is to be confronted consistently with the death of Black people on video and reports of that death, and especially at the hands of authorities and people who should be there to to protect and keep people safe, right? That's been the goal that I thought they had. And so I think that exposure for me of like being the first one that I remember when Gideon came home, I think he was about 2 when Tamir Rice was shot in Ohio, an 11-year-old boy who was playing with a toy gun in the park. And you can watch that video, and it's, within 10 seconds of an officer pulling up, a little boy is dead. And so I think there's apprehension around that. Gideon is 6 right now, and he is adorable and runs around the neighborhood and rides his bike all over rides his bike down our streets and loves to run down into the cul-de-sac and play with our neighbors. But I think as he gets older, I am increasingly full of apprehension about how the world will see him, and that he becomes more threatening as he gets older, which is terrifying, right? I never felt like people thought that I was threatening, but Gideon is going to know that there are people who feel like he is threatening, and that at some point there has to be an explicit conversation where people say, like, there are people who are going to think that you're scary, and that's horrible, so I think that's the fear and apprehension, I think, is just of not trusting the community, the larger community, and especially in the relatively white spaces that I move in, right, of not trusting that community to care for my son's life, I think, is the fear and apprehension piece that I'm feeling the most. No, thank you. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and statistically speaking, what you're talking about is actually, we call that, it happens generally for Black and brown boys around 4th grade. Mm-hmm. And that's when we actually also see an increase in their disengagement in school, because teachers and people no longer see them as cute. Mm-hmm. I say they begin to take on their masculinity. Mm-hmm. And then with that comes a threat of the Black male syndrome, so to speak. So that's, I understand that, and I see that, and I have that same fear for my little cousins and my nephews and the young elementary kids whose classrooms I walk in and out of. I see that, and it is a fear.
Yeah. As you think about sort of the hope question and thinking about the largely Black youth group that we interact with at St. Luke's and the largely Black, nursery school and kids programs there, and you said you have nieces and nephews and cousins. What do you feel like hope-wise? What are some of the things that you have hope for those kids?
Well, I have hope that, for my first hope is that they are going to survive because they are loved. Mm-hmm. And that shows up in St. Luke's. The children are loved. The first time I visited, a couple times I visited, we were at a dinner or something was going on, and someone just handed me their kid to hold. And I'm like, whose child is this? I don't even know. babysitters. But there was such that feeling of we take care of all of our children, we love our children. And sometimes it's taken me a while to get to know who the parents are to the kids, because it's such a community, and that's one thing I love about it. But I think as an educator, as a person who works with educating teachers, and who works with districts and school systems across the country, my hope is that we can move educators from being in a survival mode to what is called being an abolitionist educator. And so that means that your work is to not just help kids try to survive and make it. Your role as an educator is to dismantle and disrupt those systems of inequity, and really teach toward freedom and intersectionality. It means calling out your colleagues on their racism, on their sexism, on their homophobia, on their Islamophobia, calling that out, really changing the system and teaching from a position of love, and using those tactics of the abolitionists, which are boycotting, protesting, having your dollars speak for you. So to me, the hope is that, especially for our younger teachers, who still 96% of the force of teaching are white females.
Wow.
So my hope is that through our educational systems, we're affecting change so that our students, when they go through the school systems, they are empowered. And that they have advocates. And really also that my hope is that we can move from being allies, from white folk being allies, to being co-conspirators. And the difference, I think, is what you say versus what you do. Because I've had a friend say, well, I'm an ally. I'm like, no, you don't get to bestow that title on yourself as a white person. You don't get to put a badge and say, well, I'm an ally. Now have your friends of color said you're an ally. And then hopefully you're moving into being an active anti-racist and moving into being a co-conspirator to really destroy the systems. Because reform may not happen. It's not about reform. I'm not very hopeful about reform, but I am hopeful about the collective rebuilding of our system, of tearing them down and totally instituting something different. So I'm hopeful about that. And when I see our young people and they're continuing their education and they're moving into their world, I'm hopeful around that. My fear, especially for a lot of our members or young people that come from families that are immigrant or refugees, is that the dream that they thought was here is not the dream that is here. And that it doesn't, that they're still continuing to be motivated to move on, because the thing about this country is it is a living constitution, and we can affect change. But not to be disillusioned, because I think sometimes people have this ideal of what America is, and it is that, but it is not that for everyone. The color line is alive and well in this country, and the darker you are, the more difficult and more oppressive it can be. So that would be my fear, is that, and that things won't change as fast. I don't look for it to really change in my lifetime. I would like to say that, as my parents said, well, things will be, yes, we've made some progress, but when we're still dying in the street, like, I don't want to be overly graphic, but I'm just going to be honest, because this is a courageous conversation. But when you're shot down in the street with no regard for life, and when they can drag your body across the street onto a stretcher, when they can let you lie in the street for hours and not even cover you up, we do better. You know what's interesting? Because the person that was confronting the guy that was the woman, the bird watcher, more people were concerned with how she was treating the dog than her interaction with the black man. Yeah,
that was concerning.
It was like, well, she was holding up, she was yanking him around, the dog was being strangled, the dog was okay. Yeah, the dog was.
She is threatening this man's life, though. Right.
But what about the weaponization of white tears?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that feeling that he had to, have. So I am hopeful, but I still think, as King says, the arc of justice does bend. But I think we're seeing some straightening of it, and we have to be more intentional about that, keeping the pressure on to keep that arc bending towards justice.
I was at a prayer vigil earlier this week in Broadway Heights, and there was a man there who was a refugee from Congo, thinking about our kids at St. Luke's, and he said, I came from Congo, and it's a unstable country. But I had never had a gun pointed at me by a police officer until I came to America, and I was speeding. And that's when I had a gun pulled on me, and it wasn't in my home country, which is unstable and unsafe. But it made me realize that I'm not as safe here as I had hoped to be when I arrived. And it was like hard to hear that, because people do. And St. Luke's is such a beacon of, one of the things that has been challenging for me is that as I've become more, I think, aware of oppression, and in some ways less, glorifying of the American dream or whatever, like this idea of I don't know to what extent that I believe that that's true for everyone anymore. I think at some point I really believed hey, if you work hard, you do your best, you're going to make it in America. And I think I've become aware through living in the South Bronx and these interactions, right? All these, there are other systems that make that not possible, or much less likely for people of color, for women, for people who have different sexual orientation. This is not but one of the things about St. Luke's that is inspiring at times is how much energy that group of people, that the refugee community still brings to that idea. And it really is the best of America to watch people believe that, hey, if we work hard and we are going to make it here. And I'm watching family members succeed, and I'm seeing kids get educated. There is real beauty in that, that's inspiring, and that keeps me hopeful about America in a way that I think without St. Luke's that I would be less hopeful than I am about sort of the future and where we're headed.
And, I appreciate that, Paul, because I think that's also, to me, that's the role of the church. The church has many roles, but as a Black person, to me, that's the role of the church. And honestly, one of the things that drew me to St. Luke's was its mission. Because when it has that line about crossing boundaries of privilege and power and really coming together and having those conversations from the pulpit or from the altar, and really speaking it, because I've been in churches where nothing is ever said.
Yeah.
It's how do you know? They marched right by this church.
Yeah. And
you didn't say anything and I'm sitting here. And so am I invisible? Does this gospel not include me? Or what does this mean? So that's one of the things that really drew me to St. Luke's, was the fact that those are topics to be grappled with. Right. And we may not have the answers, but closing our eyes is certainly not the answer. But we grapple and we wrestle together, and we wrestle in love.
Yeah.
Still. So
yeah.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. So you talked just a moment ago about the talk. So have you given, I know you've given thought to it because you mentioned it. Mm-hmm. So I'm not asking you when I say when, how, I'm not asking you for, I'm going to do it on October the 15th at exactly 6:00 p.m. We're going to sit down and have that talk. But just share with me a little bit your thinking around the talk. And for people that don't know what that is, maybe you could say a little bit about, from your perspective, what that talk would entail.
So, and I'm hopeful to ask you about what your perspective of that is too, and if you can talk about a time when you have had that, or you talked about it as sort of a socialization earlier. And so, so from my understanding, the talk is communicating to Gideon at some point that he needs to be particularly cautious around police, and that that he will be likely to be viewed with more suspicion and with less grace than his white friends or his sister. And that so things like, hey, when police come, you need to know that you're keeping your hands out, that you're not making any sudden movements, that you are being very still, that you are, but I think one of the frustrating things about that is recognizing that does not seem to matter in a lot of cases, right? Like watching Philando Castile do all of the right things, right? And say like, hey, this is where I am. Here are my hands. I have a weapon in my vehicle. I want you to know that. Being, like that Philando Castile, someone had the talk with him and he did all of the things right, and it did not matter in that interaction with the police officer. So that's sort of my understanding of what the talk is. Can you talk a little bit about what that, and then we can talk about how I can do that with Gideon, but can you talk a little bit about it?
Well, I think the talk, it's always been an ongoing conversation in my life growing up in my house. And the talk sometimes varies a little bit from boy to girl. My mom always talked with my brother about, and me, because just kind of my rambunctious nature, I guess, a little bit, but about, it starts with when you go in the store, you need to stay close to your mom, keep your hands off of what doesn't belong to you, be very leery, don't touch stuff, because people might assume that you're going to steal it. I need to see where you are at all times, things like that. And also even around driving, if you get pulled over by the police, be respectful, keep your hands on the wheel, don't make any sudden movements, don't get out of the car. To me, it's privilege when the cop pulls you over. I see white people jumping out of the car to go back and talk to them. I'm like, that's the height of privilege, because that would get me killed. Because they usually even approach my car with their hand on their gun or their gun unstrapped, all that. And then you pull me over because you can't see my DMV sticker on the back, or because I've been pulled over since I've been in San Diego several times because I have a tinted cover over my license. And I just moved here from Colorado. In Colorado, that's legal. I don't know that's not legal here in San Diego. And I'm not a California native because I still have a Colorado plate on right now. But yet you pull me over, and so you keep your hand on the steering wheel. Don't make any sudden moves. Be very respectful. Yes, sir. No, sir. Try to get the badge number so that you can write it down. But as my mom always said, try to stay alive. Because I can come and get you out of jail. We can hire an attorney. We can do all of that. But what I need you to do is stay alive. There's some places you don't need to be after a certain time of night. You need to get out of that neighborhood. You shouldn't be in that neighborhood. There's certain places you don't need to really go because you know that they don't really want you there. Or if you go there, you need to be about your business and get out. So the talk is always taking kind of different forms. I have them with my little nephew, and he's not even in the 4th grade yet. But when we go places, I'm like, Sebastian, you need to stay where I can see you. Don't. And I know it's how we socialize. But some of the things my mom used to say is don't just don't scare the white people. Just try not to be intimidating, or don't scare them, because in the end you won't win. And that was, honestly, those are the lessons that my mom taught. So I think the talk is really how do you help your son and your daughter, but specifically your black son, how do you help him stay alive? It's like the video they showed a little while back about the man who kept driving. They wanted to pull him over, and he drove all the way up to his grandmama's house. There was a reason he kept driving, because he wanted to be someplace in public where he could be seen. And that was my mom's like, if you pull over, try to pull over where there's light, where there's public, where there's people. Call me, turn your phone on, do all that stuff so that you have some backup. But the key is how do you tell him, how do you coach him to stay alive? And that's one thing I would say, if I would maybe have that conversation with someone, that's another Black man that's had that conversation with their son or their daughter, and just have an open conversation. Say, dude, what do I need to say? What do I need to do? If you're close enough as a family, you might sit down and have that conversation together, because, if it's a person that he's known from childhood, that, that he feels comfortable with, because that's just the reality. How do you stay alive? Because I worry about that with my brother. When I don't hear from him for a while, and when because he's kind of a little hot-headed, and he is not as reserved as I am. And when I don't hear from him for a couple of weeks, I get very afraid. But what I would never do is I would never call the police or the sheriff to do a wellness check.
Right. No.
Because that's like saying, well, you haven't pulled the trigger on yourself. Here, let me give somebody else the gun. So what I would do is, before anybody, I would call the fire department, because they tend to be pretty level-headed. Or I have other friends in Denver that I would say, hey, can you go run by and knock on the door? But I would never, ever call the police or the sheriff to go to do a wellness check.
Yeah. One of the things that I struggle with Gideon is that, because he is, raised in a largely white space, even though we spend significant time with Black friends, and we have, we go to a church that's a largely Black church, and trying to find other spaces where he can get some of that socialization, that still ultimately he's spending most of his time with family. And so he's not seeing that. And so I am nervous that he moves with the assumption of privilege, but he will be interpreted as, as pushing boundaries, when really he's moving in some ways the way like his white father would, right? Like that's how he is moving through the world. And it's scary, right? Because it's ridiculously unfair, but it's a concern that I have, that the talk, that I'll need to give that talk. And I think you're right, that my plan is to reach out to Black men in my life and ask them to help with that, because it's something that I don't have the experience, like the lived experience, to authentically impart to him.
Mm-hmm. I would encourage you to do that, because sometimes I've seen Black boys that are in white families or biracial, but really present more Black than white. And I see them moving in the world, and I think sometimes, just to myself, I think, God, you got to school that boy, because man, he's going to walk into a situation where that response is not going to be. Now, I would love that it would change, but
right.
Until then,
yes.
How do we keep them alive?
Yeah.
How do we keep them alive? So, good. I'm glad you're thinking about having someone come alongside of you in your family, family doesn't always have to be blood. Because I see friends and family to come alongside of you to do that. So, all right. Well, I'm mindful of the time, but I do want to ask my last two questions to you. And you said we talked a little bit about it, but how can St. Luke or the church continue to support you in the raising of your son?
We have been so grateful for St. Luke's. One of Amy and I had not been Episcopal by nature. I grew up in a Baptist church, and Amy grew up in non-denominational churches. But we went the first time knowing that there was an African community, and in particular a Congolese community there. And we want our son. It's important to us that Gideon know. And if you ask him, Gideon will say, I'm from Congo. Like I am from Kinshasa. Like it's important, I think, that he knows that and has that root. But I think unless, I want that to feel real for him too, to know that he is in community with people who are Congolese or who are African. One thing that's unique about raising Gideon is the extent to which we feel like we're raising him in community with other people. We were in our neighborhood, and some new neighbors moved down in our block who are Eritrean, and we were out in the parking, or in the street one day playing, and the mom came over and was like, "Your son is African." And I said, "Yes, he's from Congo." And she said, "You need us." And they invited us in for tea, and have had Gideon over into their home, and their daughter is our babysitter. And the way that the African community in particular, but the Black people in our lives have come alongside and said, "You can't do this by yourself." And I am, it's such a humbling thing to say, like, we are going to invest in your son and want to help. And so we are just really blessed to have St. Luke's and to have the community there that knows Gideon and accepts him and loves him. And so I think, like, the support is just watching the people in that community and recognizing that he is wholly a Reams because he's in our family, but he also is wholly Congolese and learning to do Congolese dances because he's got Matrida there leading worship, and and wanting to be just like Matrida's sons, and just like he just is. But having those role models, I think, is the thing that I'm most grateful for about the St. Luke's community. So it's
the power of the village.
It is. It really is.
The power of the village. And Paul, I want to thank you for saying that, because it leads me to my last question, and I don't want you to answer it right now. Okay, so I'm going to say you can't answer it right now because I want you to think about it. But I want you to think about how can I, as a Black woman, personally support you? And just you saying that you're grateful for people saying you need me is helpful to me, because oftentimes, we don't want to step in where we're not wanted, because I believe in boundaries and I believe in respect. Yeah. And I don't have children of my own. So I also understand there's one thing to, it's different to be a parent and an educator, but yet I believe that all the children belong to us, because when I get old enough and go to the nursing home or whatever, I want them to be educated and be able to, take care of me and read and convert, metrics and do all of that. So I want to know that I'm going to be in good hands. So I want you to think about, how can I, as a Black woman, or I as a member of the St. Luke's community, come alongside of you to stand with you and Amy and Lucy and sustaining your family and however that might look. And feel free to let me know at any time, because I definitely want to be that support for you in whatever capacity that might look like.
That's an incredibly gracious thing. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hey, can I ask you about the ways? So one thing that is, as in this time of unrest, I think people are trying to figure out ways to support Black friends and Black colleagues, and the extent to which reaching out is helpful or being public about support is helpful. I'm just curious, like, what are things that right now, what are ways that we can support you, and ways that maybe that white people who would like to be allies can support the Black men and women in their lives?
That's a great question. For me personally, because I don't speak for all of Black America.
Oh, that's right.
I would like to, but I don't. One of the ways I would say is to, first of all, to acknowledge that we're here, that we're not invisible, and that it is traumatic. And so it's really one of the first ways of being an anti-racist is to acknowledge that, yeah, there is a problem. And I might not understand the problem, but I'm willing to do my own work to know what it is. So the other thing is to be willing to do your own work and not wait for people of color to educate you about what's going on. Because if you're, like I was saying, all this is happening, people weren't paying attention. Because I think that being sequestered in your house with the pandemic, having to watch that video replay and replay and replay on the news, people not having work to go to maybe, or kids not in school, or young people not having their rites of passage to move to the next level, all of that created the perfect storm. So if you're surprised, you haven't been paying attention. Because I said a while back to a friend, I said, this is going to be, before all this started, I said, you know what? I just have a feeling that this summer is going to be a very unusual summer. Because just with the policing and some of the other things that just keep getting swept under the cover, you know, or we move from one thing to the next, politically or socially, whatever is happening. So I think acknowledging, not being in denial, doing their own work, creating space, but yet knowing when to give space. And knowing when to, I'm going to use this as an example, because to me, this is the greatest way. My CEO, we were at a office year anniversary party kind of thing. And we were at the Costa Terra. It's down off by the bay. And it's a very kind of up and coming place. And I was standing at the bar trying to get a drink. And we were all there, and it was mostly white, because I work with mostly white people. And we were all standing around, and I kept trying to get the bartender to recognize me to get a drink. Well, he would walk by me, get the person next to me, and he never got me a drink. So I'm like, you know what? I don't want to pay $12 for a drink anyway. I don't want to fight about it right now, because I'm here with my colleagues. I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to be seen as the angry black woman. I really didn't want to come anyway, because I'm the only one of me. So I came out here anyway because I have to play the game. So let me just do something else. So he comes up to me and he says, hey, why didn't you get your drink? I said, well, I can't seem to get served. So he walked me over to the bar and he said, oh, I'll take care of it. So he orders a drink and gives it to me. So we walk away. I said, you know, Rob, can we have an honest conversation right now? I said, because I consider you an ally. I said, can we have an honest conversation? He's like, yeah. I said, I appreciate you getting the drink for me, but what would have been more helpful would have been for you to disrupt what was happening. Now, I'm not saying you had to go off and say, why are you being a racist and ignoring my colleague? But for you to say, excuse me, did you not see her standing here? Yeah. She's been here a while, dude, what's up? You know, I came after her. Why didn't you speak to her? And then just pose the question. And then he'll either have to say, well, I'm a blatant racist. I don't serve white, you know, black people here. No. Or either he's going to say, oh, I'm sorry, or whatever, and change. Right. But to call it out. So that's the difference between calling in and calling out. That's when we need it to be called out. And then create that space for that conversation or that realization to happen. So for me, for me personally, that's what I need. I need for you to see, acknowledge, disrupt, and then let's collectively rebuild. You know, let's work together to collectively rebuild for the sake of little ones like that right there. For the sake of little Gideon. Hi, Gideon. Hi. I love your shirt.
Can you show Miss Robin your shirt real quick? Look at that.
I love your shirt.
Hey, say again, what kind of shirt is it?
Congo shirt.
Congo shirt, that's right.
Oh, I love it. And that's the whole reason right there, Paul. That's the reason right there.
Well, I am so grateful for you engaging in conversation. I know these are exhausting times. I can't imagine being asked to talk about these kind of situations over and over and over again. Would be so hard.
I know what you're talking about.
So grateful for your willingness to engage and talk today. Thank you.
You know, it's okay. I actually feel like it's what I've been called to do. As much as exhausting as it is, I feel that everything has happened. God has prepared or set things in my life so that at a time at this, I can engage. So, but I appreciate you acknowledging that it is exhausting. But we renew through the blood of Christ. We are renewed.
Yeah.
So, having said that, let's close in prayer. Okay. And I'm just going to close with a contemporary Our Father that's near to my heart. It's the one I accidentally say when I'm with other people and they're using the old one. And they say, "What, you don't know the Our Father?" I'm like, yes, it's just a contemporary one. So I'll close with that. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Paul, my friend, will you be safe?
Thank you so much, Robin. You too.